A man who had never driven a truck in his life wrote a 3-minute song about truckers, and it went to #1 in the entire country. Pop chart, country chart, both at the same time. It sold more than 2 million copies. It inspired a Hollywood movie. And here is where the story turns strange. The song was born inside a bread commercial. Not a record label, not a Nashville studio, a 60-second television advertisement for a regional bakery in the Midwest. The character who sang it did not exist. The name was invented during a brainstorming session in an office building in Omaha, Nebraska, pulled together from a women's magazine lying on a desk and a half-remembered movie title. The initials stood for Country and Western. That was it. There was no truck, there was no highway, there was only a copywriter in a suit sitting under fluorescent lights trying to sell bread. And somehow, through a chain of events that nobody planned and nobody predicted, that fictional truck driver became the voice of a national protest, the anthem of a cultural revolution happening on the airwaves, and the spark that accidentally launched one of the best-selling music acts in Christmas music history. None of it was supposed to happen. All of it did. To understand how a bread commercial turned into a protest anthem, you need to understand what was happening on the American highway in the early 1970s. And you need to go back to a specific moment, December 3rd, 1973. That night, a 37-year-old trucker from Kansas pulled his rig to a dead stop in the middle of Interstate 80 in Pennsylvania. He did not pull over. He stopped in the lane. He got on his CB radio and told every driver within range to do the same. Within hours, truckers across 10 states were doing it. Highways jammed. Commerce froze. The reason was simple. The Arab oil embargo had hit the United States weeks earlier, and fuel prices had gone through the roof. Gas stations were running dry before lunch. Diesel was getting rationed. And then the federal government made it worse by imposing a new national speed limit, 55 miles per hour on every highway in the country. For the average driver, it was annoying. For independent truckers, it was a direct hit to their income. They were paid by the mile. Drive slower, earn less. Full stop. On top of that, fuel was now more expensive when they could find it at all. These were not employees of large corporations with guaranteed salaries. These were small business owners, many of them operating a single truck, carrying debt on that truck, and watching their margins collapse in real time. They had no union in any traditional sense. They had no lobbyist in Washington. What they had was a CB radio. And so they organized with it. They shared which truck stops still had fuel. They warned each other about enforcement traps. They formed convoys on the highway, running close together to set their own pace while making it harder for patrol cars to single anyone out. The shutdown of December 1973 lasted 3 days. In Ohio, the governor called in the National Guard. Tear gas was used on truckers who would not move their rigs. In Pennsylvania, the governor sat down with the drivers personally because his own first job had been driving a coal truck. A temporary agreement was reached. Fuel surcharges were promised, but nothing really changed fast enough. Strikes continued into January and February of 1974. The final major shutdown ended around February 11th of that year, after roughly 100,000 layoffs, nationwide food shortages, and several deaths. The government finally agreed to let owner-operators add a 6% fuel surcharge to their freight fees and guaranteed more diesel allocations to truck stops. But something larger had shifted. Independent truckers had become visible. People in Washington had not even known this workforce existed as a political force before 1973. Now they did. And the public, watching all of this unfold, started to see truckers differently. Not as anonymous workers hauling freight in the background of American life, but as rebels, underdogs, folk heroes rolling through the night with their own language, their own code, their own way of pushing back. Now hold that picture in your mind, because while this was happening on the highways, something completely unrelated was happening inside an advertising agency in Omaha. The agency was called Bozell and Jacobs. It was a regional firm, respectable but not famous. One of their clients was the Metz Baking Company, which made a product called Old Home Bread. Not glamorous. Not the kind of account that wins awards. A regional bread brand in the Midwest, looking for a way to sell more loaves. A copywriter at the agency, a man who had studied fine arts at the University of Iowa, who had grown up during the Great Depression in a small town in western Iowa called Audubon, who had spent years working in graphic design and advertising without ever making national noise, sat down to figure out a campaign. He was in his mid-40s. He had a colleague at the agency, a younger man who composed music. Together, they came up with a concept. Instead of a standard bread commercial, they would tell a story. A truck driver rolling down the interstate, a small-town diner waitress, a place with a long, folksy name. The truck driver needed a name. The copywriter looked at the things around his desk. There was a copy of a well-known women's magazine. He took the last name from that. He remembered a movie from years earlier, a film starring a well-known actor. He borrowed the rhythm of that title. Then he picked initials. The letters stood for country and western, embroidered onto the pocket of the driver's shirt. That was how the character was born. It was a bread commercial, 60 seconds. The ad told the story in a warm, half-spoken, half-sung style, with the younger colleague writing the music and the older colleague providing the voice. The trucker pulled into this small-town cafe. There was a waitress. There was charm. There was bread. It aired across the Midwest, and something unusual happened. People remembered it. Not just the bread, the character, the voice, the feeling, the way the story unfolded like a country song that just happened to be selling something. The campaign won a Clio Award in 1974, the advertising industry's equivalent of an Oscar. It was named the best overall United States television campaign of the year. That, in a normal world, would have been the end of the story. A successful ad campaign, a trophy on a shelf, back to work on Monday. But this was not a normal moment in America. This was 1974. Truckers were all over the news. CB radio was exploding, and that fictional truck driver from the bread commercial had a name that sounded real, a voice that sounded right, and a personality that fit perfectly into the culture that was forming along every highway in the country. The copywriter and his musical colleague decided to try something. They recorded a single under the character's name, not a jingle, an actual song. It was based directly on the commercial, same character, same world, same style, that storytelling voice over a country arrangement. It came out in 1974 on a major label. It sold around 100,000 copies and landed on the country charts. Not a smash hit, but enough. Enough to get a recording contract. Enough for an album. Enough for more songs in the same vein, all telling stories from the same fictional trucker's world. Mountains in Colorado, long stretches of highway, old trucks, characters with handles and histories. The copywriter was still working at the ad agency. He was not a musician by training. He was an ad man who happened to have a deep, warm voice and a gift for narrative. His colleague was the one writing the melodies and arrangements, but the character was bigger than either of them now. And then, in November of 1975, they released a particular single. It was not exactly a song. It was more like a radio play set to music. It opened with the crackle of a CB radio. A voice, calm and confident, called out a handle. Other voices answered. You heard the language of the highway, the real language that real truckers had been using for years, the code words and the shorthand and the rhythm of Channel 19. And then the convoy started. The song told the story of a group of truckers forming a rolling protest, building numbers as they crossed state lines, blowing past toll booths, ignoring speed traps, heading for the state capitol with a political point to make. It was fiction, but it felt like documentary. It felt like the trucker shutdowns of 1973 and 1974 set to music. It felt like the frustration of the 55-mile-per-hour limit turned into a 3-minute anthem. Every trucker who had been part of a convoy, real or improvised, heard their own story in it. Every civilian who had been listening on Channel 19, fascinated by this world of handles and smokies and rolling defiance, heard a confirmation that the culture they had stumbled into was real. and powerful. The single came out in November. By January 10th, 1976, it was sitting at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, the pop chart, not just the country chart. It sat at #1 on the country chart for 6 straight weeks. It reached #1 in Canada. It hit #2 in the United Kingdom. It sold over 2 million copies in the United States alone, earning a gold disc from the Recording Industry Association of America in December of 1975, before it even reached the top of the charts. Some estimates put total worldwide sales above 7 million. Billboard named it the #1 country single of 1976. Rolling Stone later placed it 98th on their list of the 100 greatest country songs of all time. Think about what had just happened. A copywriter in Omaha, a man who had never driven a long-haul truck, who had created a fictional character to sell bread, had just scored the biggest hit in the country. Pop and country simultaneously. The character, invented for a 60-second commercial, was now a household name. The song was not a novelty, even though many people called it one. It was a protest, wrapped in entertainment. It captured a specific anger, a specific frustration, a specific moment in American life when the working man felt squeezed by forces beyond his control, and it put that frustration into a form that you could sing along with in your car. It was the trucker's anthem, but it belonged to everyone who had ever felt like the rules were stacked against them. That crossover is what made it explode. If it had been a novelty song, it would have been forgotten in weeks. It lasted because the feeling underneath it was real, even if the character delivering it was entirely made up. And then, Hollywood noticed. How could it not? A #1 song with a built-in storyline, a charismatic character, a visual world of trucks and highways and rebellion. In 1978, a major motion picture was released based on the song. It was directed by one of the most acclaimed and controversial filmmakers in American cinema, a man known for violent, uncompromising westerns. The lead was played by a singer and actor already famous for his own rough-edged charisma. The budget was $12 million, a significant sum in 1978. The film earned over $45 million at the box office worldwide. It was not a great movie by most critical standards, but it made money. And more importantly, it cemented the image of the Convoy, the rolling protest of independent truckers united against authority, as one of the defining cultural images of the 1970s, all from a bread commercial. But here's what most people never learn about this story: what happened next. The copywriter did not become a rock star. He did not move to Los Angeles. He toured for a while, performing as the character he had invented, because by now the character and the man were fused in the public imagination. He appeared on network television, including one of the most watched late-night programs in the country. He headlined concerts, but he was in his late 40s when the hit happened, and he was not a man who had ever wanted the entertainment industry's version of a life. He was a graphic artist from Iowa. He liked mountains. He liked quiet. And so, he retired. He moved to a tiny town in southwestern Colorado, a place nestled in a box canyon in the San Juan Mountains with a population of less than 1,000. The kind of town where you drive an old Jeep in the 4th of July parade and everyone knows your real name, not your handle. And then, in 1986, the townspeople elected him mayor. He served for 6 years, from 1986 to 1992. During his tenure, he focused on raising funds to rebuild and improve the town's infrastructure. He was involved in environmental causes. He drove his Jeep. He stopped into local businesses. People called him by his first name. The man who had written the biggest trucking anthem in American history was now attending town council meetings and talking about sewer lines and road maintenance in a mountain village at nearly 8,000 feet of elevation. He lived in that town for the rest of his life. He passed away on April 1st, 2022, at the age of 93. Cancer. He had been born on November 15th, 1928, in a small Iowa town, the child of parents who played musical instruments, a kid who grew up during the hardest economic years America had ever known, and who somehow ended up selling more records about trucking than any real trucker ever did. That is one half of the aftermath. Here's the other half, and it is arguably even stranger. The younger colleague, the one who wrote the music for the bread commercials, the one who composed the melodies and arrangements for all those trucking songs, including the #1 hit, did not stay in advertising either. But he did not retire to a mountain town. He went in a completely different direction. While working on the trucking songs, he had been developing his own musical ideas on the side. He was interested in electronic instruments, in synthesizers, in a kind of music that blended classical structure with modern production. In 1974, even before the big hit was released, he had founded his own record label in Omaha. The label was named after an old musical technique, a rolling pattern of notes used in Baroque-era keyboard music. It was not a country label. It was not a pop label. It was something entirely its own. For the first few years, it released experimental instrumental albums that sold modestly. And then, in 1984, the composer released a Christmas album. Not a traditional Christmas album, a reimagined one. Classic holiday melodies run through synthesizers and modern arrangements, given a lush, cinematic quality that sounded like nothing else in the Christmas music market at the time. It sold slowly at first, and then it did not stop selling. Year after year, when the holiday season arrived, the album came back. Word of mouth carried it. Radio stations played it. Families adopted it as a tradition. That album, and the ones that followed it, eventually made the composer one of the best-selling Christmas music artists in history. Over 41 million albums sold across the catalog, more than many of the most famous names in all of popular music. A touring Christmas show that is run for decades, playing arenas across the country every holiday season. Follow the thread again. A bread commercial in the Midwest. A fictional truck driver. A copywriter and a songwriter, both working at the same ad agency. The copywriter becomes the voice of the American trucker. The songwriter becomes the architect of modern Christmas music. Both careers launched from the same 60-second spot for a regional bakery. Nobody could have drawn that map in advance. And the bread commercial itself? What was it, really? It was a story. That was the whole trick. The copywriter understood something instinctive about how people listen. He did not make an advertisement that said, "Buy this bread because it tastes good." He made a tiny world. A truck rolling into a small town. A waitress behind a counter. The beginning of a story you wanted to hear the rest of. The bread was almost beside the point. You remembered the characters. You remembered the voice. You remembered the feeling. And when that same feeling, stretched out from 60 seconds to 3 minutes, arrived at a moment when the country was angry about gas prices and speed limits and a government that did not seem to understand how the average person made a living, it did not just sell. It detonated. Why did the song land so hard? It was not because of the melody. There was barely a melody. It was essentially a spoken word piece with a rhythm track, a country arrangement, and the sound effects of a CDB radio. It worked because of voice. The copywriter had a deep, unhurried, confident voice. The kind of voice you trust without thinking about why. When he described the convoy forming, you could see it. When the voices crackled in over the radio, answering from different trucks, different states, you felt the size of it. And underneath the humor and the CB slang, there was genuine defiance. The characters in the song were not asking permission. They were not petitioning anyone. They were simply moving together at their own speed, past every obstacle put in their path. That image, the idea of ordinary working people taking collective action by just doing their jobs together while refusing to be pushed around, resonated far beyond the trucking industry. Office workers bought the record. Suburban families bought it. Kids who had never seen a truck stop bought it. It was not really about trucking. It was about refusal. Organized and joyful. That is a feeling that never goes out of style. Consider the timing one more time. In 1973, the oil embargo hits. Truckers shut down the highways. CB radio explodes from a hobbyist niche into a national phenomenon. In 1974, a bread commercial wins a Clio Award, and a fictional trucker becomes real enough to record an album. In 1975, the song is released, riding a wave of cultural energy that has been building for 2 years. In January of 1976, it reaches number 1. In 1978, it becomes a movie. And then the wave begins to break. The fuel crisis eases. The speed limit, while still technically enforced, becomes less of a flashpoint. CB radio starts to decline under the weight of its own popularity, too many voices on too few channels. The specific conditions that created the moment, the anger, the solidarity, the novelty of ordinary people having their own broadcast network, all of those things start to dissolve. The copywriter retires to the mountains. The songwriter builds a Christmas empire. The song stays in the culture, played at truck shows and on oldies stations, but the movement that gave it its power evaporates like static. There is something in this story about the lifespan of cultural moments, how they rise when specific pressures converge, a fuel crisis, a speed limit, a new communication technology, a population of workers who feel invisible. Those ingredients do not combine on purpose. Nobody sits in a room and designs a moment like that. It happens because a dozen unrelated forces arrive at the same intersection at the same time. And when someone, even accidentally, even from inside an ad agency, captures that intersection in a form that people can repeat and share, it becomes something much larger than anyone intended. The copywriter did not set out to write an anthem. He set out to sell bread. The anthem happened because the world was ready for it. And when the world stopped being ready, the anthem became a memory. But the memory stayed warm. It stayed warm because it was true. Not factually true. The convoy in the song never happened. The character never existed. But the feeling was true. The frustration was true. The solidarity was true. The defiance was true. And that is enough to keep a song alive for 50 years. There is one more detail worth sitting with. The fictional character, the bread commercial trucker, the made-up name pulled from a magazine and a movie, became so completely identified with the copywriter who created him that by the end of the man's life, the two were inseparable. When he died in 2022, every obituary used both names, the real one and the invented one, because neither felt complete without the other. In his little mountain town, people called him by his real name, but the rest of the world knew him by the handle. That is the strangest part of the whole story. A man invented a character to sell bread, and the character became more real than the man. The handle outlasted the name on the birth certificate, which raises a question that goes beyond advertising and beyond the music business. When you create something that perfectly captures a moment, does the creation belong to you, or do you end up belonging to it? The copywriter from Iowa might have had an answer for that, but he was a private man who preferred mountains to interviews. What he left behind was a bread commercial, a #1 song, a Hollywood movie, a 6-year stint as mayor of the town you probably cannot find on a map without zooming in, and a collaborator who went on to sell 41 million albums of Christmas music. All of it connected. All of it traceable back to a single creative decision in a single office in Omaha, sometime in 1973, when 2 men decided to tell a story instead of making an advertisement. That was the whole difference. They told a story, and the country was listening. If this gave you something to think about, whether it is the song you forgot started as a bread ad, or the fact that your favorite Christmas album exists because of a trucking single, or just the idea that the biggest moments in culture are almost always accidents, leave a comment. Tell us what you remember. Tell us if you ever drove with that song on the radio. Tell us if your parents had a CB handle. Subscribe for more stories like this one. This one is for anyone who ever rolled down a window on a long highway at night and felt like the whole country was out there in the dark, moving with them.